The original DevilNeverCry's environmental storytelling and atmosphere is second to none in the series, largely thanks to its roots in survival horror, having started out as Resident Evil 4 of course. Today we'll be going through odd and obscure things in the game that you might have missed that tell us more about the game's setting, Mallet Island, where an ancient force of malevolence threatens to take over the world, and our protagonist Dante has just 24 hours to put it to rest for good. That brings us to the first and the biggest question of them all: where exactly is it? The cutscene that introduces us to Mallet Island seemingly has it floating out in the middle of nowhere, but what if we could find a way to somewhat deduce, geographically, where its location is on Earth? At least, in-game that is. Starting with comments from the game's director himself, Hideki Kamiya, he goes on to state and confirm that Mallet Island constantly moves from location to location to avoid being detected, and that of course the island represents the point on Earth which is the closest at any given moment to the underworld. Whilst that statement's great for providing context, it still doesn't really tell us all too much, and so we have to look to the game for further clues. Our first clue can be found in Mission 4, specifically inside the Castellana's bedroom, where Dante happens to find a note that states the following: "There are documents here that were probably used for diplomacy with the neighbouring countries." Now, I don't know about you, but that cutscene where we were introduced to Mallet Island had it smack dab in the middle of nowhere, with nothing around it, so that kind of confirms Kamiya's statement that this island loves to move. With that brought to light, there's no doubt in my mind that the only reason that Dante and Trish managed to make it to this island, with a boat chartered from Morrison no less, is because of Trish's intimate knowledge of its location. That's well and good and all, but what we're trying to find out is its location within the 24 hours in which DMC1 takes place, and for that, again, we have to look a little deeper. Our next clue as to the island's location stems from a demon, specifically the Sargasso. Dropping into the freezing water abyss below the island in Mission 3 provides us with our very first encounter with these demons. Hiding between the edges of the sea and the underworld, they wait for stray wanderers and feast on them. Their name is very much on the nose considering the Sargasso Sea is a real location, and it just so happens to border the infamous Bermuda Triangle, where all manner of crafts throughout history would often go missing when traversing through it. As to how or why things have disappeared in this region is probably better left for another time, but what I do want to focus on is that watery abyss that I'd previously mentioned. If you look hard enough in the background, and I mean really look hard enough, you'll spot this particular plane propped up amongst the rubble. Previously, I thought that this plane being here might have been a slight reference or Easter egg to another game that Capcom had developed, 1942. But when paired up with the idea of the Sargasso Sea and the Bermuda Triangle, it potentially might be a reference to the infamous Flight 19, where in 1945, a fleet of planes was seen flying over the triangle before disappearing into thin air, never being seen again. Mallet Island bordering or potentially being inside the triangle itself would be fitting, considering the true nature of the castle. So, with its location potentially locked down, let's move on to the next important question. What on earth happened to this castle, and more importantly, where are its inhabitants? Contrary to popular belief, the marionettes that we face in combat are not the previous inhabitants of the castle. The enemy file for the marionettes actually sheds more light on their true nature. Marionettes are low-class evil spirits that borrow the bodies of puppets in order to exist in a physical state. This much is evident as when they're destroyed, you can see something like a spirit dissipate into nothingness. As to why the castle was filled to the brim with life-size puppets, well, let's just say demons have needs. After all, the perfectly hard wood makes for a... Getting things back on track, thanks to some snooping in the game's library, which just so happens to be crammed with over 500 books of that, we know that the castle has been around since at least the 12th century. We know that the castle was also run diplomatically by a series of Castellans, and it's implied that initially, the inhabitants believed in all manners of divinity. The castle grounds feature statues of a water goddess, Salacia, if we stick to the game's theme of Roman divinity. Early on, we see a statue of Saint Michael, complete with his spear, or even statues or reliefs of angels, said to be the guardians of a god. Before long, however, inevitably the inhabitants of Mallet Island begin to worship one god in particular, the one that we see initially in the game's very first mission, who turns out to be none other than the Demon Emperor himself, Mundus. Certainly is ironic, worshipping a demon as a god, but Fortuna and Sparda went through the same thing. Continuing to search through the grounds of Mallet Island, we begin to find more notes, and we know from these notes that the demonic influence began to fester in the castle, and as a result, all manner of madness began to ensue. One report that we find in a storage room states, "Most of the incidents that occurred at night are atrocious and dismal, as if the night had turned the people mad." That notion or idea of people simply going crazy seems to be a bit of a running theme. A diary entry found in the Castellan's bedroom corroborates this. "Often, I feel that time passes awkwardly around here. In some places the flowers never die, in others they wither ever so quickly. I cannot stay here for very long, for I know my sanity will leave me." As time begins to slip on Mallet Island and nights bleed into days, the demonic world's influence begins to manifest both throughout the land itself and its inhabitants. As Dante flicks through the pages of another book that he pulls from that library, we find that there were lists of crops that were harvested from the feudatory. Strangely, the amount of crops harvested were never stable, and there were instances when winter crops were harvested in the summer. Some of the reports that Dante finds on Mallet Island seem to be rather subdued, implying things rather than outright stating them. That is, of course, until you find this particular report, which is about the rearing of the castle. It states that during the late 12th century, the castle had gone through a number of modifications since its establishment as a citadel. The last sentence in the book in particular gives the whole game away, where it asks a rather important question. Why have the successive Castellans modified this castle so repetitively and unnecessarily? Were they possessed by some kind of evil spirits? And that is about as overt as you can be, going from worshipping demons to directly being possessed by them. As the facade of pleasantry and diplomacy slips, incredulous taxes were imposed and barbaric executions were enacted. You could potentially say that the taxes were imposed to finance the alterations to the castle, and the barbaric executions were for anybody who attempted to stand in their way. All we can deduce from this is that somebody who hadn't lost their head yet was definitely taking note of all these strange occurrences. Anybody who's played DevilNeverCry knows that the Philosopher's Egg and the Elixir in particular play a key part in opening the door to the underworld, with both items also holding substantial importance in the world of alchemy. So it should be no surprise that the castle library, again, holds several books on the subject, alongside books relating to black magic and rituals from all over the world. If we were to theorycraft a little bit, perhaps the excessive modifications to the castle were a way to guide the inhabitants into inadvertently completing the necessary rituals with the elixir and opening the gate to the underworld. Wishful thinking perhaps, as it seems like the idea never got off the ground, and it basically forces Dante to do all of the dirty work in the game instead. At the very beginning of Mission 2, on the ground floor of Mallet Castle, at the end of the courtyard hallway, the game throws just a dash of foreshadowing at the player. It's a landscape painting. There's an eerie aura surrounding it. The painting itself is of Mallet Island, albeit warped and twisted, perhaps implying that an inhabitant of the castle befell the same fate that we do 17 missions later when we enter the mirror world, drawn in by the beauty of its dark reflection. Perhaps they saw the horror that we saw and decided to paint what they witnessed. Needless to say, I don't think they were ever the same again once they went through that mirror. The luckiest inhabitant of them all, arguably, is the soldier that we stumbled upon in Mission 8, who somehow wandered into the intricacies of the castle and simply died of exhaustion. Though they may be dead, it definitely beats being ripped apart by demons. During the island's period of normality, a prophet once visited, where he stated that Pluto shall come on the promised date and separate heaven and earth. One with black wings of treachery shall come and stand in Pluto's way. Pluto in this instance being the Roman equivalent of Hades, the god of the underworld, and so in this context we can assume that they mean Mundus. The black wings of treachery, though, may refer to the legendary Dark Knight's son, Dante, perhaps carrying the mantle of his father. To round out the video, I'd like to focus on one final note left by the castle's inhabitants. Something about a strange occurrence in the cathedral of this castle is written. It happened on a hot, humid night. The columns twisted and a statue of a god disappeared. We quickly sealed the cathedral in the hopes that someone righteous with a strong heart would save us. The cathedral in question holds Phantom, the boss of Mission 3, and the inhabitants really did go to great lengths to seal off this part of the castle, hiding the courtyard key within a painting, leaving the Staff of Judgment in an unreachable area, and sealing off the second entrance to the library with a stone tomb. Perhaps it was meant to be one last act of defiance before succumbing to evil. DevilNeverCry is a treasure trove when it comes to its atmosphere, a defining trait that I hope they bring back for any future DevilNeverCry titles. If you enjoyed this video, do be sure to leave a like and consider subscribing for anything and everything DevilNeverCry. With all that said and done, it has been me, DevilNeverCry. I'd like to thank all of you for watching, and as always, I'll see you all next video.